Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here in your great city for the first time, and it's a pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to speak with you, and thank you very much for the opportunity to do so. When I first joined the United States Coast Guard almost 30 years ago and went to sea, there were many things to learn, and I asked many questions, but my chief, he never answered a single one. He always told me, go look it up yourself. And that was very frustrating at the time, but I've come to appreciate his wisdom because I developed a habit of always looking things up for myself. And that became very useful later in my career when I became a Coast Guard Marine Inspector, because researching regulations is an essential part of regulatory compliance. And so it's critical. Oh, I didn't figure out how to advance. There we go. So what I'm here to talk to you today about is compliance. And we've heard a lot about regulations this morning, and people really get frustrated with the amount of regulations that there are. And so what I'm here to explain to you today is that compliance is an achievable goal. I realized after retiring from the Coast Guard that not everybody wanted to look up regulations and that they needed a little help. And so I came up with my company 10 years ago, Maritime Compliance International, to help people get in compliance and stay out of trouble. And so, compliance is an achievable goal if we have commitment to see it through and a strategy on how to do it, and the leadership and management skills that are necessary to ensure proper execution of that strategy. So I came up with a comprehensive model for maritime compliance management that I'd like to share with you today. And you can apply this model to any regulation that has been mentioned today. Just pick one. And we can actually assess any company and find that their problems with compliance are most likely a result of a failure in one of these components. True commitment requires awareness. It's a monumental task just to keep track of all of these regulations that come down the pike these days. For example, the U.S. Coast Guard recently published a regulation requiring classification societies doing certain work in the United States, such as approving repairs on a foreign vessel, to be approved by the Coast Guard. That regulation went into effect just last month, September 10th. Sometimes we're aware of regulations, but they're hard to accept. For instance, who would have believed it would be true that it's a requirement for vessels to manage the rain running off of their decks while in the United States? But it is. But as leaders, we must accept all of these regulations, because if we want our crews to comply with them and keep the vessels out of trouble with enforcement officials, we have to. It is critical to have a thorough understanding of the intent of the regulations. Many times we think we know what it's about, and we go at it halfway, and then we end up getting picked apart. But it's very complicated these days. For instance, there are regulations, codes, IMO circulars. In the United States, we have the Marine Safety Manual. We have navigation and vessel inspection circulars, the Code of Federal Regulations, and numerous policy letters. It's a lot of information to get a grip on. But even if we think that we have a good understanding of this, sometimes it's essential to sit down with regulators and find out exactly what their concerns are, which is something that I recently did. I visited with Coast Guard officials, Port State Control, and I asked them directly what their concerns are. And this is one official, what he relayed to me about the top 3 things that vessel managers should be concerned with. He said, number 1, the chief engineer must be thoroughly familiar with the safety and environmental policy of the company. Number 2 was the oil record book. And he said that the oil record book must match exactly the printout of the oil content record meter. They actually take the last 4 evolutions and take the printout and go make sure it matches exactly what's in the oil record book. And that's essential. And then lastly, he talked about ISM, specifically Section 5.1, the Master's Review. They expect the master to be thoroughly familiar with the ISM manual. Section 7, which is shipboard operations, where you're supposed to list all your shipboard operations that require written procedures, and 9.1, the requirement to self-report. When we talk about understanding, it's important to understand the intent of a management-based regulation such as ISM, which is to minimize human error by following written procedures that represent the best practice for a particular evolution. And I think that concept has been lost on ISM because we have very large manuals with endless checklists and forms, and sometimes we miss the point on that. So you need a strategy. Don't think that because your ship just passed an inspection that it's in compliance. Because every inspector is different. They look at different things and they have different opinions. I'm sure many of you in this room will agree with me. You know what I'm talking about. You can't rely on that. And that's why it's essential to have a management system. And for prescriptive regulations, it can be as simple as job aids, such as ones for SOLAS, and particularly the ones used by the U.S. Coast Guard if you're operating in the United States, such as this, what's referred to as a Coast Guard 840 book. This is Foreign Freight Vessel Exam Book. It's all in there. Also, they have for the EPA Vessel General Permit. For management-based or performance-based, such as ISM, it's important that the manual be customized for the vessel and crews. Companies start off at a disadvantage when they purchase a very large manual off the shelf just stuffed with a bunch of checklists, instead of engaging the crews and going through the risk assessment process to first determine which evolutions require a written procedure and which ones don't. And then to determine of those which ones require a checklist and which ones don't, and of those which ones require work permits or some other controls and which ones don't. We really don't have to have everything in the manual. Risk assessment is critical. Training. It's essential that the crews not only be trained in how to comply, but why. If they don't understand the purpose or intent of what they're doing, even the most conscientious will falter over time. You can give the crews all the checklists in the world, but if they don't know what they're doing, it's useless. For example, I was recently on a ship. I was reviewing a completed checklist. I saw that the lifeboat was checked off. I asked the captain, "So tell me how this lifeboat was checked." He said, "Well, we make sure it's still there and that it's not obstructed." That is of no use at all. I remember being on a Coast Guard boarding where the Coast Guard inspector detained the vessel because he found that the rations down in the bottom of the lifeboat had been soaked from rainwater. Now, for management-based systems, there's a few tools to use. The one that we like the most that I wanted to share with you today is a safety management workbook where the crews are forced to read a real-life scenario from the workbook and then go research in their own safety management system what it says that they should do about that particular scenario. And just to make sure they don't make it up, there's a place to write down the page and the paragraph number. This is really the best way to learn. Better than just sitting there reading the manual, it actually applies. Many companies get to this stage and fail because execution is the most difficult. It requires hard work, and it's not easily outsourced. But they must be provided oversight. Typically, the level of implementation is consistent with the level of oversight. So it's no wonder if the implementation level is low when oversight is left only to what is required by regulation. And discipline is critical. An unfortunate reality that we have to accept as managers is that some individuals will not comply unless they perceive some negative consequence to themselves. Simply the threat of the vessel being detained or the company getting a fine is not enough to motivate some people to do the right thing. There must be some personal consequence, such as the loss of their position. Indeed, good order and discipline has been part of seafaring from early on. The sailors of the days of the old Navy were very careful not to disobey orders or to drop a bucket from aloft, as the penalty for either of those offenses was 12 lashes. Of course, I'm not advocating that we return to the days of the cat and nine tails, but only to make the point that without personal consequences for some individuals, there won't be full compliance. And lastly, systems should be in place to measure the effectiveness of your program and engage crews to get their feedback in the spirit of continuous improvement. Recently, I was doing an ISM internal audit on a ship that I've been dealing with for a number of years. And the captain was showing me his corrective action requests that he had written up himself. And one he had written up was because they had missed their last required lifeboat drill. And the reason they missed it is because they were dredging a very hazardous bar, which is infamous for its high seas and breaking surf. And so it was way too rough to do a boat drill. But what impressed me was not that the captain was keeping on top of his drill requirements, but it was what he wrote in the corrective action and the lessons learned. He wrote that he should have anticipated that conditions at the bar would have precluded a boat drill, and that he should have conducted the boat drill prior to arriving at the bar. Furthermore, for corrective action, he wrote that going forward, all captains will anticipate conditions that could preclude them from conducting required operations. He got it. I have never seen a better example of implementation of ISM than on that vessel. So compliance is an achievable goal. And if you have the commitment to see it through, a strategy on how to do it, and the proper leadership and management skills to ensure the proper execution of that strategy, you'll gain the peace of mind in knowing that you're implementing a truly compliant program. Thank you.